it's inflated by commuters, and they're the very people that are putting up house prices. I am worried that we're, in a sense, slightly different from the rest of Wales. So when you talk about the norm, I'm not sure that Monmouthshire fits in the norm. And I'm anxious, just in terms of equity, that people who perhaps have very little actually end up having to pay over the odds if we go for option one. If the tool is there to sort of balance it out over time, so that house prices, which are not the fault of the people who are taking out the loan, could be equalised by applying the Bank of England methodology, for example. I think option two would be a fairer means of doing it for the people in Monmouthshire because of the situation we find ourselves in Monmouthshire.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Brown has indicated.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think I would support the last speaker in terms of option two because, you know, my concern is that, you know, a 10,000 loan could end up being 20,000 and, you know, I think that if that's the case, then the take-up of them, if it's on an equity basis, may be lower. And I would have thought the fairer system, because we're dealing with vulnerable people, would be on the basis of doing a sort of an index-linked inflation proof, so that when you get the money back, the 10,000, say in X number of years, it's worth 12,000, then I would have thought that was the fairest thing. But I'm not quite clear on your report, because there is a difference between the retail price index and the another one, which I think is a consumer price index, and it's not clear on your report exactly what measure you will be using, because I know in pensions they changed things from the RPI, which was a better rate, and they reduced it to sort of a consumer price index, which was lower. So I think if you're bringing in a scheme just saying on an inflation basis, we need to know exactly how you're going to work this out, because it's not clear from the report. Thank you.
Steve, do you want to respond to that?
To take the Councillor Croker's first point, totally accept that. The one advantage of option one is that it replenishes the pot, and replenishes a pot so that we're able to offer. It increases the plot as well, and by increasing that pot, we're able to offer more loans to a greater number of vulnerable households in the county. So, and I believe that it is equitable in such a way as that it's proportionate then to the value of the house, and that value stays the same. Because as I probably did admit to the initial calculation, you have to take in when that loan is worked, for want of a better word, now worked out. It's worked out as a percentage. The loan is worked out as a percentage of the value of the house it's taken out on, and that percentage, which is 4.93, in the example I gave, that percentage then is projected then onto any new value of the house. So it's proportional to any new figure. On the second issue, with regards to working out the difference between CPI and RPI, I have to say I'm unable to answer that. I don't know, except that if you use the online calculators, they've obviously used a standard industry, whatever that standard industry is.
Excuse me, Steve. It is the CPI. I've just looked.
You just looked?
Yeah.
There you are.
I wonder if I could just come back on that.
Sorry, you can indeed, and then sorry, just to note that Councillor Harris is. Are you happy, Councillor Harris, to just let Mark? Yep, fine.
I take what's been said, and yes, there is a logic there, but surely we're taking an increased amount of money from somebody who potentially has very little money to start with. You know, if we're talking about a vulnerable group of people, then saying the pot gets bigger, but it's actually at the expense of a vulnerable person, potentially, that the pot is increasing. And that doesn't seem fair.
Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. I basically don't agree. If you're option one is the one that I go for. You know, if your house doubles in value and therefore the basic payback, if you like, is doubled, I don't think any dependents or most homeowners would argue too much about that. And the important thing is that the money goes into the pot, so there is more money in there for other people to take advantage of the loan. And as far as I can see, the loan's never maxed out in any case. Is that correct? So year on year, we never, if you like, use up all our £600,000, because most people don't know about it. And I think if people did know about it, then I can't think why they're not biting their hands off, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, but the loans haven't been introduced yet. The equity release loans haven't been introduced.
Just to add to that, it will be interesting to see what sort of take up whichever option we go. We did have an option. We did have an equity release scheme in Monmouthshire a number of years ago, and we linked it with the Disabled Adaptation Programme. So particularly where people weren't eligible for a DFG because of income, they had the opportunity of an equity release loan. And we had zero take up, very little interest. This is this is different, but again, I think that the jury's out to see what level of interest there may or may not be.
I just want to clarify one point, and then I've got Councillor Dimmock and Councillor Brown. I think one thing that is concerning members is this issue of it being vulnerable households. I think that we perhaps need to clarify that. I don't know what the actual testing of that is, but as Councillor Harris says, we are talking about a very proportionate amount of repayment on the loan. And I think that members are concerned that it isn't actually, in general, from what I can tell, going to be the person who takes out the loan who ends up repaying it. Is more likely to be when that property passes on via sale or transfer on death, or that they move into a different kind of accommodation. However, I think some further clarification of what you mean by, I think that slightly muddied the water in a way, because proportionate seems reasonable and fair, but I think the issue members are trying to bottom out is this issue of making sure that people don't seem vulnerable and don't seem to lose out, and are clear about what it is that they're getting into, because I think we've had a number of I don't know what you might call sort of in the private market, some concerns about the way that people have taken out equity release schemes. And so I think members would be really keen to have clarity on that. So I'm going to take the other members' questions, but if I can just leave that for you to respond to in a minute. Okay. No, okay.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to go with Roger on this. I think option one. I think the people that will gain from it will obviously have gained in monetary terms from the uplift of their property. I am a little nervous around when you say vulnerable. I do want clarification, so thank you for that, Chair. Also, when you said schemes prior, no one took them up. Why was that, out of interest? You know, we're going to have the same issue this time round.
Can we just make sure everybody's using their microphone because it won't pick up on the live stream? Thank you. Councillor.
I mean, I was looking at the report, and obviously one of the things it said in 3.2 is said, due to mixed success of the grant scheme throughout Wales, Welsh Government introduced new criteria, terms and conditions in 2018 in the hope that there will be greater take-up. Now, my concern is certainly I wouldn't want to go for an equity release type of scheme, and I don't like those schemes. And the assumption is that you know, it'll be payable when somebody dies. Well, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it could be a situation whereby they then have to sell the property to go in a care home and then find they're short of fees to pay for a care home because of the fact that the council is taking a big slice. And I also think that if you don't go for option 2, then you may well find, as in the previous example, people don't take it up. So there's no good having a fund of 600,000 if nobody's actually going to use it. I mean, what I would suggest doing is going for option 2 and then perhaps reviewing the take-up of it to see exactly what happens, because there's no use having a fund there that nobody's going to use. And I think if you go for that first option, which I personally don't like, and I wouldn't be interested if somebody came to my door and said, are you interested in doing that? I mean, I think rather than that, I'd rather sell the property and move somewhere else. You know, so I don't think that's a particularly good solution. So I think you get more take-up if you went for the sort of index-linked CPI scheme than you would if you went for this, you know, 10% of your equity type of scheme. Thank you.
Brown. I've got Councillor Woodhouse, Councillor Harris, and then I'd like to go back to the officers to clarify this issue of vulnerability. Sorry, I've got another officer who wants to speak. Yeah. Okay.
I think it's worth sort of reflecting back on where we've got to this position. And the reason that Welsh Government brought in this pot of money is because the vulnerability is about people that haven't got the means of paying back home improvement loans. So I reflect on what Councillor Brown is saying, but there are people that have lived in a property for a long time that might have familiar memories that would rather actually have an equity release loan than move out. And on the point of paying care fees, actually, whatever they pay, they're going to pay something back to Monmouthshire County Council. They could just be paying for their care as opposed to be paying back more off of the loan. And I think when we think about the vulnerability, the people that are the most vulnerable will not be sitting generally in houses that will be paying huge amounts of money back. Their property prices would be lower, hence what they're paying back would be lower. We're talking about people that would be sitting in very, very expensive properties, albeit I appreciate they would be asset rich and cash poor, but they wouldn't be paying that money back until actually they have generally died. That's the information that we're getting. And the other point that perhaps we haven't reflected enough is we're going to be working with a credit union partner called Robert Owing, and they will very much handhold the applicant for this process. They will actually fully understand the loan, and it won't be like going into a high street bank where they are paying huge fees and taking on huge percentage. It will be a very fair and equitable system. We've got no idea how many people would be interested in this loan. It will be slightly different to the one before because it will be a credit union-based product. It will be marketed by them. They've had a lot of success in Powys and other areas that they've done that. And it's really to look at people that wouldn't have been able to have had a home improvement loan. We have had a lot of people contact us about home improvement loans, but they don't pass the credit rating to actually pay that loan back, which is why we think in Monmouthshire this will be a lot more successful in our home improvement loan scheme. It's also worth knowing people could have this product a long time. So it's quite important that we recycle as much as we can back into the pot, or we could just run out of money quite quickly if we have long loans that go on for 20 or 30 years. So it's just those few points.
Thank you. Councillor Woodhouse and Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chairman. I totally agree with Councillor Brown and Councillor Grocott. I felt far more comfortable with option 2. I must be honest, it seems to be quite fair. and we want people to feel comfortable with this themselves, to obviously enhance the take-up of it. I was pleased to hear you referring to it successful in Powys, because that was going to be one of my questions. Has this been taken up in other areas? We haven't had any take-up here yet. But obviously, this is a different... I understand this is different terms and conditions on this one to what we've had on offer previously. How long is it going to... how long does the process... is it going to take? Because, I mean, a lot of people will get a little bit nervous if it's going to be a lengthy process. And coming back to eligibility, people who are vulnerable, yes, properties that are eligible, it's a big issue, I think, for people to embark upon. And what I'm saying is I just consider option 2 to be the fairest. And the last question is, how is this going to be advertised? That's going to be the key to get people to take this on board, to roll it out to information. We need to support this to enable people to get to know about it.
Thank you, Councillor Woodhouse. Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think it really matters how long if you like, the loan lasts, because nobody's paying any money back in any case until the end of it. And don't forget, it's a fixed amount at the start. But some of us remember a period when interest rates were astronomical, 15%, etc., etc. That could happen again. We should never forget that. And 10 years at 15% interest rates, well, goodness knows what that might end up with.
Have I got any other members that want to speak? No? Paul? Maureen? No? Okay, fair enough. I think that what I'm hearing from members is clearly not a united view. There's some concern around the issue of vulnerability and what we mean by that. Although I think on the other side, hearing about, people who are asset rich but cash poor and are in their homes and may want or may really need a home improvement that they couldn't finance by any other means in order to stay in their property, seems like a very positive thing to have. I'm also particularly taken myself with the point of view that this is a credit union product, and that the credit union would be supporting applicants through the whole process so that they're very clear about what they're getting into. I think that may give members some some comfort and reassurance that this is very different to some of the high street equity release schemes that we've seen that really do cause issues for people. I am not sure that we're able to give a very clear steer at this point. Can I just ask if there's any other information officers feel would be helpful for members to... and then I'll just ask members to indicate which one they feel is appropriate. And I think we might have to offer more of a narrative for Cabinet's consideration than a particular steer, if that's the case. Is there any other information that you would wish to provide members with?
Can I come back to the term vulnerability? I chose the wrong word without probably engaging my mind. It's in this instance, if I had to attach any vulnerability, it would be just solely with regards to the ability to make repayments under the other schemes that we will hope to be running in the council, in the local authorities. It's purely on the fact that it's unaffordable. All other means of borrowing is totally unaffordable. There is a criteria with regards to the property and the condition of the property, but with regards to the applicant, it isn't about vulnerability in a wider sense, other than their ability to make monthly repayments. And on a wider scheme, this this loan is like a suite of options that we have and introducing in Monmouthshire for not just for older people, but for to uplift then the condition of private housing in Monmouthshire. Monmouthshire has very old or substantially old properties, a number of properties. A lot of them are in need of being having their energy efficiency ratings increased, and this is one way, amongst other ways, that we're introducing in Monmouthshire.
And just really to add to that, again, it's probably something we should have said at the beginning, but as part of the context, Monmouthshire does not provide any discretionary funding for renovation grants, repairs grants for the private sector for quite some number of years. I think this is one of the part of the background behind Welsh Government issuing the funding. They've obviously keen to move away from a grant-funded regime to a loan, because to a loan regime, and obviously this it plugs probably a small gap for Monmouthshire, and your point about how we will advertise, it will be linked to everything else we do. So, for example, Sarah manages the Disabled Adaptations programme, so we would promote the grant in the event of somebody not being eligible for a DFG. So we see it, so it will be promoted responsibly, by ourselves. Whoever we are looking to go into a partnership with a credit union, again, there'll be a responsible organisation, and it will be pitched as a last resort.
Okay, members, I've just got one contribution from Councillor Harris, and then I'm just going to ask you to indicate, and then we're going to sum up what we were going to put forward for Cabinet's consideration. Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. It's been mentioned that there may be it may be difficult to get the relevant amount of publicity for this particular scheme, and there's 8 of us now discussing it this morning, and there's obvious divisions within the number of us. I think personally this is such an important scheme that it's something that full council should know about and actually debate. So all 43 of us, or however much more number than there are here now, can know about it, and once we decided, we're in a situation to help publicise it as well. So, I'm not quite sure what we're going to recommend this morning, but I would say this should go to full council for much wider discussion.
Thank you, Councillor Harris. So, just to summarise then, members were asked to consider the implications and the options outlined in the report. There were 3 options provided. I've not heard any support for option 3, members, so I think that the option 1 and 2. Option 1 is the one where effectively there's a proportionate, depending on the value of the I'm not very good at summarising this. The value of the property at the time of taking out the loan to the value of the property to the time of redeeming the loan, on whatever basis that is. And option 2 is the one which is where the loan is then linked to the consumer price index. So we've had 2 options. We've debated them fairly thoroughly. I still think that the way the report was set out, indicating vulnerability, has probably led members to be more concerned than they may have been if that term wasn't included in the report, albeit that I think members are very keen that this offer of a home improvement loan to people who maybe have assets but don't have the income to repay other loans would want to see that be fair, equitable, open and very transparent, and members were certainly more content, I think, and reassured that the product would be offered via a credit union. And I think that from that point of view, I wonder whether that's given members any further contentment. I'm going to ask members just to quickly indicate which one they'd go for in a moment. But I think that we can see that there are pros and cons to both, because option 1 allows us to replenish the pot so that if the scheme proves to be successful, we have the opportunity to offer more loans so that we have people who are able to access them that can't access other means of keeping their houses safe, warm and secure, which I think is probably an important point, members. Option 2 does not allow us to replenish the pot necessarily, and therefore it may result in us not being able to meet need over a given period once that begins. That's a risk, I think. However, members, I think, were minded that it is possible for price increases to be substantial in the Monmouthshire region. However, it's also probably important to note that the repayment is proportionate. So because there is a substantial increase in the value of the property, it's still proportionate to the loan that was taken out and the value of the property when taken out. I think those are important. So members, we don't have a clear preference. Those members wishing to support option 1, would you just indicate for me so that I know, got an idea? Okay, and those options more in favour, those members more in favour of option 2? Okay, so there is a majority view in the Adult Select Committee that option 2 may be more appropriate. Albeit they understand the risks that could mean to the pot in particular. I'm not sure that we can offer much further comment to Cabinet, but we can offer that narrative in our summing up. And Councillor Harris has asked that whatever the decision is, that in order to provide in particular members with good quality information about the opportunities that this offers, that it's widely circulated. Obviously, you've requested that it be debated at full council. I don't know if that's an option or an opportunity. We could certainly recommend that Cabinet may want to consider, because it is quite an important decision, I suppose. But and I suppose is there anything that members would wish to add to that as a kind of summary of our deliberations? So I got Mark and...
Just based on your comments, which we're obviously going to take back and reflect on, what about if we considered a cap?
I was just going to say, actually, sorry, Councillor Brown did suggest that if option 1 was considered, that a cap might be a consideration.
Yeah,
that you could think about. Sorry,
for the more valuable houses, to make sure that isn't off the line with the repayment.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could actually, although I'm in favour of option 2, which is the index-linked type of option, I think actually you could go for sort of a difference between option, sort of a middle option between option 1 and option 2. And the way you could do that would be, say, for example, if there was a loan of 10,000, that you would guarantee that the amount you would recover would not be more than, say, 50% of that loan. So it was 15,000. And the fallback position would be an extra calculation to, in effect, to make sure that the index linking was, if, for example, the index linking went up to 20,000, then you might, from the original 10, then you might say, well, there is that default position. So if you first of all looked at, say, option 2, then if you actually said, well, index linking produces sort of X figure. It's a bit complicated, but I think you might get the idea, but maybe it is too complicated, I don't know.
So to add to our summary then, I think also, and I do apologise, Councillor Brown, thank you for reminding me, that perhaps a hybrid is considered, which offers the safeguards that members are looking for, that it is not disproportionately unfair, but also that the pot could ideally be replenished to allow for more homeowners to take out the loan. So we would welcome, perhaps, if there is any opportunity to develop those options slightly further, to be a little more sensitive to the market. Does that make sense, members? Are members content with us?
Just broken the microphone. Swiftly repaired it. Yeah, I think that the overall message is in your summary that we want this to be fair, but we want people to be able to be confident that they can take it. The take-up is the important thing in this, that we don't want anybody put off by the fact that their property price could go up and or inflation could go up. We want people to be reassured that it is fair, and we want them to be able to be, how can I say, in a position to use it. This is what we want, isn't it? People to be, that's the overall aim of our, I think that should be the overall aim of the discussion, the summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Woodhouse. Is this an additional point, Councillor?
Yes. Can you make sure in the report that I recommended that it went to full council, so the Cabinet know that if we don't agree as a committee?
Chair, if I could just come back on the decision-making process. We'll certainly report that to Cabinet member. My understanding is in terms of decision-making, Council would normally only consider things that significantly change the Council's policy stance, which this probably wouldn't qualify. But we certainly make Cabinet member aware, and if she wishes to refer it to Cabinet or on to Council, then we'll leave that with her as that decision. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Well, that feels like, as far as we can go today, and a reasonable outcome. Hopefully the discussion has been useful to officers in taking that piece of work forward. Thank you, members. Can I just ask, because we've got guests here to speak, would you be content, members, if we move item 8, so the impact of the rollout of universal credit, forward on the agenda, so that we can allow our guests, who we're very pleased to have, to leave if they need to? Is that okay, members? Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Then can I ask that the impact of the rollout of universal credit, discussion on discretionary housing payment policy linked to the increased use of food banks reported by Trussell Trust is considered? And can I invite you, would you like to come and sit at the front, Caris, because that might be easier. Exactly. And just to say, in order to speak, you just press that. Otherwise, it doesn't pick you up on the live stream. Thank you very much. Okay, so can I defer to you to introduce the report then? Thank you.
Right, good morning, members, and thank you for inviting me to your committee this morning. As was said at the outset, I'm Head of Revenues, Benefits, Customer Services at Torvine, but I'm also Head of the Benefits Service, the Shared Benefits Service that we've hosted on behalf of Monmouthshire since 2011. So I have a tattoo on this arm that's Monmouthshire and one on this arm that's Torvine. This report is about supporting Monmouthshire's poorest, most vulnerable residents to access, as we've heard earlier, precious rented housing, or to safeguard their tenancies in an era of reduced support via the benefits system. The Council has a proud record with respect to discretionary housing payments. It has been commended in its approach by Shelter, and it's amongst the 2 highest spending discretionary housing payment local authorities in Wales, the other being Torvine. And I think the approach that the Council has taken has been really positive and has had an excellent impact. And within the report, we've sought to illustrate those impacts. When I previously came to speak to you, about this. You confirmed that the council would top up the administration grant that we received from DWP by £60,000. So that's enabled us to spend slightly more than we would ordinarily have available. I believe that approach has been successful, and I'm looking to you to reaffirm your support for that policy approach. The report that we've provided contains the policy criteria for making discretionary housing payment decisions. I don't propose to go through that, but it is an appendix to the report. But it is ultimately a discretionary decision, and it's dependent upon a wide variety of factors. I believe we've got some case studies that have been provided by Monmouthshire Housing Association that illustrate the complexity of some of these issues. We've also got 2 case studies within our report. Just to touch upon the background to this in terms of the benefit system and the government's welfare reform agenda. The major reforms currently affecting Monmouthshire are as follows, and I think colleagues from the Shared Benefit Service and from Trussell Trust will be able to comment on, and indeed from the housing side of the council, on the impact of universal credit, the government's flagship policy for replacing 6 legacy benefits. This was introduced in June 2018 in Monmouthshire. I can touch upon, I think, and I haven't included this within the report, but I think it's pertinent to our discussion this morning. I'll touch upon some of the impacts of that reform in a moment. We still have other welfare reforms in place that the government introduced 5 or 6 years ago. There's the bedroom tax, or the under-occupation charge, whichever you wish to call it, which reduces the rents of those in social housing. There are private sector rent limits, particularly for young people under 35, that restrict rents significantly. There's the household benefit cap, which limits the amount that a household can receive in terms of its overall benefits. My service is ideally placed to view the impact of these issues because we still deliver housing benefit. We still work closely with the DWP with respect to universal credit. We administer council tax reduction on your behalf, free school meals on your behalf, guardianship and adoption payments. So we've got quite a wide view of the benefit system as it affects Monmouthshire. And increasingly our work is about supporting customers, enabling them, giving them financial advice and budgetary support, not just assessing their claims for benefit. And that's a relatively new focus for us, and that's what universal credit has moved us towards, because it is encouraging households to take more responsibility for managing their own finances. So the transition to universal credit can be a difficult one for Monmouthshire residents, and we have a dedicated resource in place, Claire, who works with the Job Centre and other agencies in Monmouthshire, including people in Ian's team, with respect to universal credit cases. So that's the backdrop, and as I say, I'm seeking for you to reaffirm the existing policy with respect to discretionary housing payments. Just to look at and focus, I think, for the purposes of this discussion, on the impact of universal credit. We have 4 main negative impacts. I'm sure if there were representatives from DWP here, they would say there are positive impacts with respect to universal credit, but there are still 4 things that we are struggling to support residents around. The transference to universal credit is a significant period of adjustment for households, and despite the mitigations that the government put in place to support people moving to universal credit, I think it's fair to say that people are still struggling. They still need short-term emergency assistance. They still need help from food banks, etc. And that's something that I think we need to be aware of, and it still needs to be looked at in terms of the mechanism and the framework of claiming universal credit. Period of adjustment for customers is very significant, particularly that first assessment period where they make the first claim. Secondly, there are fluctuations in entitlement due to assessment periods. If you're on universal credit and you're paid twice in one assessment period, rather like if in Monmouthshire your pay date is moved slightly forward because it would fall on a Sunday, and it happens that you have 2 payments within a 28-day period, those 2 payments are included within universal credit assessment, and so consequently it could significantly affect the universal credit you receive. It can even wipe it out. You may get the benefit in the following period, but it won't be as significant as the loss in the first period. Another area of concern is self-employment. There's an assumption after 12 months of self-employment that that customers will move on to the equivalent of national living wage, and we all know from businesses, some set off very well and make profits quite quickly, others don't. They take 2 or 3 years to settle in, and inherently I think that is an issue within universal credit. And the other issue I'd like to draw your attention to are the deductions and sanctions that are applied to customers' benefits, which can have a significant impact upon the amount of entitlement that they receive. There's no limit on those deductions or sanctions at the moment, although there is a proposal to limit the sanctions. So you, for one reason or another, due to the recovery of overpayments, council tax arrears, rent arrears, you could have a significant loss in the amount of universal credit that you receive. I only say these things because they read across to discretionary housing payments, and more often than not, those customers who are struggling with short-term assistance are looking to agencies like the council, like Trussell Trust, and there are other agencies, Discretionary Assistance Fund, Welsh Government, other Welsh Water, who provide short-term assistance. But one of the main mitigations that we have is the Discretionary Housing Payment Fund itself. So I just want to be clear that I think I'm looking to you for your support in terms of our continued and ongoing approach to administration of discretionary housing payments.
Can I invite, if you have any contributions to make, Caris, if you particularly want to talk around what that looks like in reality then when, for example, people are waiting to receive universal credit, or indeed they've had a sanction or reduction in their or deduction made. What's the experience of the Trussell Trust, and also how does the interface work maybe between someone who's in that position, come for assistance with the discretionary housing fund, and then the referral process? Maybe that would be helpful for members, and then members can, if you would like to give us a little bit of an outline of that, then members can have an opportunity to ask any questions they might want to clarify. Thank you.
Good morning. Okay, so I work, as I said, with Richard within the benefits section. we receive referrals usually from the Job Centre Plus and work coaches, people that are applying for universal credit. I also receive referrals from other agencies, from housing associations, even from the council tax sections where people are non-engaging, and we're looking to see if there's any assistance and any reasoning behind it. We've got quite a few case studies, which I think you may have seen, but inevitably people that are struggling are people that maybe have come out of work and need to make a claim for universal credit. That initial claim, the government have brought in changes so that when they make their claim, they can request an advance at an earlier stage. However, you still have to submit the claim and then go along to the Job Centre Plus interview to verify your identification and what have you. And it's at that point that customers can request their advance. Now, that could be a delay of up to a week between the time they make their claim and actually get along to their first appointment. So they've got to survive for that week, feeding the family, providing gas and electric, and rent. Rent is the first priority. So people coming out of work, their last wage is also obviously included in their first assessment period. So the first award of universal credit is going to be affected by the last amount of wages that they've received. Hopefully, a lot of people will have used that last wage to pay their bills, but they've still then got to struggle through to the next universal credit payment date. So there's a lot of issues there, a lot of time that we've got to tide over. And we do try to use the DHP fund to help people who are looking for support with their rent. We're also providing food bank vouchers and applying for discretionary assistance fund, which is through the Welsh Government. But again, that is limited and that is an emergency situation. I spend a lot of time going to the food banks, delivering food to people, which is obviously an issue within Monmouthshire being rural. I don't know, did you want to come in on that?
If you're finished.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is that okay? Thank you for inviting me to speak, Chair. I have a kind of an overview I could offer of the Trussell Trust situation, or perhaps you prefer me to go straight into the points that have been raised. If I begin just with a quick overview for, thank you for my colleagues here and what they've explained and how they've explained. I think I would echo the Trussell Trust experience is very much in line with what you've both just said. The overview I wanted to share was our end of year statistics that came out for the financial year. They came out at the beginning of April and beginning of May. I think they were referenced in the last meeting, which is why I believe you've asked me to come and speak in part to explain those statistics. In Wales, there were more than 113,000 three-day emergency food supplies given out in the last year. Almost 41,000 of these went to children across Wales. This was a 15% increase from the previous year's statistics from the Trussell Trust. Bearing in mind this is within our own network, there are also independent food aid network as well that operates. That's across the UK. I think most of them in Wales, the majority are actually Trussell Trust food banks, but it's just to bear in mind this is only part of the picture across the UK. A lot of the majority of the reasons, I don't know how much to go into the detail, but the vouchers that are provided give a detail of why the person has had to come to the food bank in the first place. And the majority of reasons were linked to benefit changes, benefit delays, and low income, which more often than not, 80% in some cases were people who were actually on benefits, just they weren't meeting the cost of living. So due to the statistics that we get, the data that we receive through our food banks across the UK, and it's obviously across Wales, this drives our policy work and our work as to what we feel is important. So it feels very much it's on the ground work, on the ground statistics that we feel it's accurate representation of why people, the drivers to people coming to food banks. As a result, we've started a campaign called 5 Weeks Too Long, which is the 5-week wait when people apply for universal credit. Sorry, my throat's gone a bit funny today. Yeah, if I could. I woke up with a little bit of a sore throat, sorry. So that campaign is trying to end the 5-week wait. So what happens, as has been explained already by my colleague, that when someone will come change over onto universal credit, there is a period where they have to wait for that to come in. They have it in arrears. The idea, the DWP would say, is in line with how you receive your monthly payments when you're in work. However, as it's been explained, this often ends in increased debt. People already are on a financial knife edge, and to have to wait 5 weeks without any income is just what's pushed people over the edge. So that's what we found with the Trussell Trust, that the increase has been 51% of the referrals in the last year were linked to universal credit changes. As a result, as I say, we're campaigning now to try and end that wait. And that's probably the main factor, I think, at the moment linking in. I've got other comments I can add as well. I hope that's helpful.
I think it would be really helpful, Caris, if we can hear a little about your experience in Monmouthshire in particular, and what kind of pattern, trend is that increasing? You mentioned that you're up 15% in Wales. What does that look like in Monmouthshire?
Absolutely. Oh, bless you. Thank you. Yes, of course, Chair. That would be. So the general picture was 15% across Wales, as I've mentioned. Interestingly, in Monmouthshire, the statistics are 14% increase from last year. So that's a 14% increase in the amount of emergency food supplies that were distributed. 14. So it's in line with the general increase across Wales. There are others. Seeing as my colleague from Torfaen here, I know I've been to a meeting in Torfaen Council as well, trying to mitigate the effects of universal credit. It is interesting to see the effects across Wales. I would just share that in Torfaen it is 11%, so slightly lower, but there are other charities such as RCT, which is up to 40% increase. So I would just stress the importance of mitigation from the council. And the ways you do that, perhaps can talk about another time, but I think it is important to just acknowledge that universal credit is a significant factor. In Monmouthshire, the figures were 2,852 parcels were distributed. People were fed. That was 978 children. And the Trussell Trust stance is that this is not okay, that there shouldn't be a need for food banks, and that this increase is a direct result of universal credit. There are other factors as well, other benefits, other delays, but as the overall statistics was that 51% of the delays were linked to universal credit, so there were other delays as well. But because it's such a big factor, this is why we're trying to address the 5-week wait. So I think I also have up-to-date, which is more internal. I appreciate this is in a public forum, but these are not. These are records for this financial year, so from April to June, just to update you on Monmouthshire. So these aren't public records yet. But so far, just from this financial year, there have already been nearly 500 people fed across Monmouthshire. The statistics from that are, again, in line with the current trends, which are 22% of the reasons, which are the reasons we get on the voucher, as I've said. So these are the reasons that people are coming in to the food bank, are changes in benefits, so that will include universal credit. 18% is due to benefit delays, which again is linked to the advance payments, and 30% of the reason is because of low income. And because this is quite a catch-all on the voucher, which is one of the things we're trying to change. It just says low income, and that obviously could mean many things. We're also discovering a lot of that is in work poverty. So people are already working, it's just their income is not meeting the cost of living. So as I say, those statistics, those percentages are in line for this year, in line already with what happened last year. Excuse me. In regards to housing discretionary fund and housing, and that I don't have as much information about that. The only thing we do have, which I thought might be relevant, was statistics on how many people come in who are in a homeless situation. I don't know if they would like me to share that as well. So for the last financial year, it was actually 9% of people coming in. This is specific for Monmouthshire. That on the voucher ticked as the reason they were there was caused by homelessness. As I say, in this period now, they're not made public yet, but the period now is 8% of the people that have come in this financial year are due to being in a situation of homelessness. So the trends show that so far this year, we're in line with what happened last year. There is an increase. We're in line with the Welsh trend as well in Monmouthshire. Whether that's good or bad, there are some councils that are a bit lower, some that are higher. Either way, it's an increase. And we would argue that that's not okay and that's not a good thing. There are a few other issues that I could go into more locally about the food banks, but perhaps that would be it later.
I think it would be really helpful if you could perhaps just outline those, but also in terms of mitigation, you mentioned mitigation. Additional to what we're already doing, what do you think are the key issues, or what could we be doing more of? I think that would be helpful before I open up the debate to members. Thank you.
Actually, from the Trust point of view, we're not recommending anything at the moment, specifically for councils. I think I might have to pass that over to my colleague, only because we are careful of being apolitical. We're not trying to, but also we also want to be based very much on our facts and our statistics. So one thing I would just add is that we've just released last week a 3-year research project called The State of Hunger, which is linked with Heriot-Watt University, which is looking into the deeper drivers of this, because as I say, our initial statistics only shows low income. So what we're trying to do is go really into the detail of why people have come. One thing I can also share is that the high proportion of people are disabled and the high proportion of people are single men, and it's just trying to understand why, what could we do to help those particular more vulnerable people. So apologies, I can't specifically give examples, partly because I don't want, from a Trust point of view, it's official recommendations. We're just trying to do it very much based on the facts we receive, if that's okay. I don't know if you would have anything to add to mitigation.
I'm apolitical too, so
Yeah.
In terms of mitigations, I think we use the mitigations that are available to us. I mean, a lot of our work now is about supporting residents, helping them to manage their financial affairs. As I said, the focus has changed slightly, so there are mitigations out there, and we've become aware of them. I mean, from my point of view, I'm just seeking for you to affirm the approach that we're taking with respect to discretionary housing payments. We're not seeking to increase the level of support, but we think that this level of support is sustainable.
Sorry, could I just add? It's in retrospect now, because the full rollout happened in June 18, as Richard said. But one of the mitigations that was successful, and I don't know if it was you, Claire, who went to visit the food banks to talk to them before. I don't know. I went in to go and talk to the project managers, the food banks, the volunteers, in a way warning of what might happen and trying to talk to the people. So that was a success. I just wanted to add that the 4 negatives of the of the universal credit that Richard outlined, we would agree with. So the transference, the fluctuations, self-employment, deductions and sanctions, they are all issues that we've come, and where there are facts that we have got about, we've got case studies as well. There's a campaign going on at the moment that we are doing every week, a different example. Last week was about people coming in from domestic abuse situations. There are people who, as I've mentioned before, who are disabled that are particularly affected. And also there was a case study recently of someone who was self-employed, as you said, who just wasn't able to access any funds. So I suppose in the mitigation side, all I would say was I would echo and agree and think that what is happening at the moment is a very good thing, and we would be behind that.
Thank you, Caris. Is there anything further about particular, very local circumstances? Because we understand what's being said around the discretionary assistance, but I think it's also important for members to consider if there are any further steps that council could or should be considering. Thank you.
I'm very specific now. There are 3 food banks: Abergavenny, Chepstow, and Monmouth. And Abergavenny at the moment, this is current. This is in the process of being sorted out. So, if you like, hot off the press, but is struggling at the moment for storage space. The franchise has been ended by the existing franchise holder. So Trussell Trust is in conversations at the moment with different churches in Abergavenny to take on the franchise, because we operate, I don't know if we as a franchise holder, so there are independent charities that run the food banks, and we kind of like an umbrella organisation. So my role is area manager. I look after 18 food banks. They come to me through support, so that, just in case you don't understand or didn't know the structure. So at the moment, we're in consultation with different churches in Abergavenny to try and take on the franchise. Essentially, and there's one church, Abergavenny Baptist Church, who is very keen to take that on, but trying to expand that into an interchurch, into other civil society, NGOs getting involved. So I suppose, knowing that quite a few of the councillors here are from the Abergavenny area, I just wanted to raise that so you're aware that this is an issue. The main issue at the moment is storage space and funding, really. So perhaps I'm just putting that out there as an awareness, and so that if you could perhaps keep an eye out for that in the area. Chepstow and Monmouth are doing really well. They're in a good position. Sadly, their statistics also show an increase, but I suppose that was the local, very specific. I don't know, perhaps if that was too specific, I apologise. Okay, so thank you.
I'd just like to add that I know you just mentioned that you might have noticed Caldecott has got a food bank as well, but that's Ravenhouse Trust, so it doesn't come into Caris's. And there are also obviously the churches, there are also lots of other charities out there that offer food parcels, which would be statistics on top of the ones you've already heard. A lot of the housing associations carry food parcels and will help their individual tenants as well, and we do draw on that. And we're also trying to support people not to just become reliant on the food parcels and the food banks. We are encouraging them and working with them to try and improve their situations and to try and work on their budgeting. So we do look at food cooperatives that are running across Monmouthshire as well. It's not purely, just going from one place to another looking for handouts. And there's a lot of people that we come into contact with that are embarrassed that they're in the position to use the food banks. So we find ourselves sometimes as a conduit, really, between the food banks and the customers that need them.
Thank you very much. I think that highlights quite a stark picture, members. Can I just remind you that we've got a recommendation which is around reaffirming the council's approach to the award of discretionary housing payments, but we might also want to consider some of the information that we've just heard, not least the fact that whilst there are 3 food banks operated by Trussell Trust in Monmouthshire, also there is Caldecott, and we do know that. So those figures probably don't scratch the surface of, the true picture of people in emergency, hunger, need, really, in crisis. I also note, members, that disability is a real factor, and one that I'm sure will concern us. And we've highlighted single men as also being a particular issue there. So can I open it up for your questions to our very welcome speakers, and then we'll go on to think about our recommendations and anything further we think needs to happen. I think this is quite an emotive subject and an important topic for us, I think. Members.
Just a bit of clarification, really. The discretionary grant, is the discretion on whether a council takes it up or whether an applicant that comes to the council gets it? I just wonder where the discretionary comes into the discretionary grant.
Yeah, the latter. It's about whether it's a discretionary housing payment. It's about the decision-making process, not the grant itself. The grant, we receive an administration grant from DWP, and then we're looking to top that up with a £60,000.
Thank you, Chairman. You were talking, Richard, earlier about people that are self-employed, and I note that you did say that sometimes they will accept them for a loan with only 1 year's books. If you go to get a mortgage or anything like that, they insist on having at least 2 years' books before they'll even think about it. Are you doing that because you need to help them, or do you feel that that is sufficient record? Because it always seems unfair to me. If you're self-employed, you have to go through all this. You might have, if you've got a job, you could lose that job next week. So you're just as vulnerable if you're employed as you are if you're self-employed.
Yeah, it's a good point. I was talking about the rules as they apply within universal credit. For the first year, you don't have to provide detailed statements of account. But after the first year is complete, then they assume a level of income that is equivalent to the amount of hours you work times the national living wage. And the point being that quite often businesses take a little bit of time to develop. And as you say, even supporting statements of accounts won't evidence a particularly high profit after a year in business.
I've got Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I wanted to just ask a question a bit about the discretionary housing payments, and would certainly support the recommendation of the council to top this up, because I think it's been a well-used fund, because I think that's what it says as the recommendation 2.1 to reaffirm the council's approach. But I did notice that it does actually say about some local authorities not taking up, their full allocation, and this being underspent. And I just wondered if there was any recourse to go for that. I mean, I do have some further questions about the time gaps and things like that, but I tend to ask too many questions at once, and then I don't get them all answered. So. If that's okay, thank you.
Just to deal with that point, yes, the government has been very critical of authorities, the UK government, because it's provided quite a significant amount of funding in terms of discretionary housing payments, but some haven't spent the amount that's been allocated to them by the UK government. So we're actually in the sphere where we spend more than we're given. But some authorities, including Valley's authorities, haven't spent their allocation. So, I think there's a drive now for those authorities to spend their grants and spend their allocation. I believe in the last year there was no unspent grant in Wales, but in previous years there has been.
Is there any chance of, because there's an excess of pot left, of going for it, as it were, or is that out of the question? I mean, obviously you do want the local authorities to fully spend it, because you don't want anybody in need anywhere, regardless. But I'm just thinking in terms of the UK DWP budget if they've allocated a certain sum, you know, and then obviously if it's been underspent, then presumably there is some funding. And I'm just thinking that obviously because we've allocated a further sum to this, which I think we do need to do. You know, is there any option of asking the UK government if our funding could increase on the basis of the fact that we've obviously done well in spending not only what we've been given but more than that, and we've demonstrated a need as a result, and so I was just asked that question, and I'm a bit concerned about this gap, because was the purpose of the DHP to try and help cover this gap? I'm not really sure what the purpose of it and why we've got this 5-week gap anyway, and you know, what can be done about that, because obviously, you know, you don't want people without funding. Thank you.
So just on the first point, we can ask the question. I don't think we've ever asked the question. I imagine the answer would be no, but we haven't. No, I don't think as a group of local authorities we haven't asked the question. I'll promise I'll take it up with our DWP partnership manager and ask her if there is any unspent grant. Can we have it for Monmouthshire, please? So I will definitely do that. With respect to the 5-week delay, it isn't intended that we should use DHPs to help people who fall foul of that delay, but it's probably one of the few mechanisms that we've got to assist customers who require emergency assistance. The intention of DHPs is that they are short-term assistance with rent. We have alternatives for food, and we've got water rate relief. We've got assistance that we can provide short-term with gas and electricity. But in the absence of any other assistance, we provide it. And when people come asking for it, we can always consider them, and we refuse very few awards, but we do refuse awards. But on the whole, we support people in short-term emergency situations, and they look to the council for that support.
So, I think, Councillor, the 5-week gap is to do with the DWP administration. It's nothing to do with local...
Do you want me to... Shall I? Yes, the 5-week wait that we reference is the period of time before the first payment, and that is DWP. As far as I'm aware, I might be speaking out, but I don't think there's anything you could do about that. What they do offer, DWP, is a loan, and perhaps I didn't go into that in as much detail. Yes, yeah, which is called an advance payment, but effectively it's a loan. And what happens then is they have repayments. Now, I'll just refer to there are issues that we have raised with that, again, from our statistics, one of which is that there isn't, the repayments don't take into account people's ability to repay them. And the government's own policy about any lenders would be that you have to take into accountability of how you can repay those, how much income you have. That isn't the case with this. So people end up with quite a significant amount having to be repaid. So the advance payments or loans are to bridge the gap of 5 weeks. So, but what happens then is that when the payments start, deductions come out, which is when Richard referenced the deductions. Sanctions are a separate thing again, but the deductions themselves can be up to 40% of the total repayment, but the total loan. DWP say it's very rarely that high, and I believe the recent amendments are going to be reducing the cap to 30% in October this year. But still, as statistics and case studies that we've found, for people living on a knife edge, people on a very precarious financial situation, 30% of what you're getting anyway to be taken out as a repayment is a significant amount, and that's what forces people into destitution, coming to food banks. And I want to echo what Claire said as well. There are other ways that people access help, and also within the food banks, I just want to say, it's not just about food either. It is about signposting and then working with partnerships to address other issues. One effect from the repayments and the lack of income then after the 5 weeks can be rent arrears. And again, I would agree with what Richard said, that there are other places where you can go to for help. But I would say housing, I would agree, is one thing that we have a fuel bank, for example. The Welsh Water offers help, as you've already said. I would just echo that is the case as well, we found. I think the cap going down to 30% is progress, but yes, we would argue, and what we are campaigning for is to end the 5-week wait completely, to have increase the ESA run-in so that you have an overlap of when you have a 2-week payment, and then just reduce the gap completely. Yeah, I think that's probably...
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Pavia and then Councillor Woodhouse.
Thank you, Chair. Just in relation to the new approach that Cabinet Secretary said that she was going to implement. She was obviously very clear when she took up a post earlier on this year. There were real problems. She had real concerns about how rollout of universal credit had taken place. How is that playing out now? Obviously, when I spoke to the food bank in Chepstow back end of last year, they were concerned there was going to be a spike, start of the financial year, end of March, start of the financial year. Now, there's obviously been not a pause, but a slowdown, particularly in some of the elements of the pilots, reorientating some of the models there. How is that playing out locally? Are we seeing any difference?
You're talking about Amber Rudd becoming Secretary of State. Yeah, I mean, I think she did signal a change of approach. But some of the things that she has proposed haven't come in quite yet. So the reduction in sanction benefit and deductions that was mentioned earlier isn't quite coming in yet. There's additional. We talked about the switchover period, that first period where you get universal credit. At the minute, there's a 2-week housing benefit transition payment. There will be other transition payments, as I understand it, for job seekers allowance and ESA, etc. Don't think they've quite started yet. So we haven't really seen the impact. The 2-week transitional payment for housing benefit was something that she introduced, and she slowed down the rollout, and she's indicated that she wants to reflect on what's happening. It certainly was welcome, let's put it that way, because things were moving a bit too fast. I don't know in terms of, the food bank statistics suggest there hasn't been a great deal of changes yet.
Yes, I would agree with that. That it slowed down the changes that occurred. One of the big changes is more a delayed effect. So the managed migration was a key thing we were campaigning on. So the people at the moment, universal credit would be. I apologise if everyone knows this already, but people who were on new claims, and the managed migration will be when all the people on existing benefits change. They've delayed that, but again, that hasn't been stated exactly when. I think it was to later in, and then other small changes. Like one of the things we were very pleased about from our campaigning was an increase in funding. So one of the things we say is there just needs to be more money in the system, and that was starting in June 2020. So the problem at the moment is until these changes happen, and obviously at the moment with the situation with the new Prime Minister, things are on hold anyway, I think. One thing I would also highlight, just yesterday in the hustings, each of the Conservative leader candidates all were asked a question about universal credit, and they all answered, I will paraphrase, that there would be changes made. I might have to re-clarify that. I think Jeremy Hunt said that there were issues, but maybe not changes. But I would encourage everyone to look at those comments as well. So I think there's a recognition within all of the political parties that things need to change and amendments need to be made. Some people disagree with the policy completely, but whatever the political side is, that there are changes that need to be made, again, as a mitigation against these things. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to say, I totally support the discretionary housing payments, and thank you for the clear understanding of how things are working currently. With regard to the food bank, a very important issue where I visited one recently, and it's the support and the advice that's given that came over loud and clear, as well as the food and the ability for people to come somewhere local, somewhere friendly. It's then at a difficult time being offered support, and that is very, very important. You did talk about the signposting, but yes, I just wanted to expand on that and say that is a very important service as well, part of your service.
If I can just add, thank you for that comment, Councillor Woodhouse, because I was conscious that when Claire mentioned about the other services, that is a key part of the Trust model. It isn't just about food. It is acknowledging that there are multiple issues and drivers, which is part of, as I mentioned, the research trying to go into that. But yes, it is very much about what we would call more than food. And also the other key value that we want to offer is dignity, because as was also mentioned, there is a shame and an embarrassment, and I'm glad to hear that, so thank you for your comment. But I would like to echo that it's about working in partnership with different organisations in the area, in the town, wherever you are, and also with other independent food banks as well, to work together to try and address them in a more holistic response. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to say, what sort of nation are we that forces citizens under the badge of a welfare reform package to go to food banks? I think we all ought to be ashamed.
Okay, thank you, members, for I think that the information that we've had from those delivering services to what would appear to be some of our most vulnerable residents, I think has been really helpful in this debate. In summary, members, I'm hearing that Council would certainly like to reaffirm the Council's approach to the award of discretionary housing payments, including additional financial support as previously agreed, which to date is 60,000. A question I have is that if we were to add to that, would that make more of a difference? And I'm also still keen to explore what more Council could do, because to summarise some of what we've heard, members, that many people are experiencing a delay of up to 5 weeks because the DWP is processing the initial claims in particular. We've heard that 51% of visits to Food Bank are linked to universal credit, and that is for a 3-day emergency food package. We've heard that there has been a 14% increase in Trussell Trust food banks in Monmouthshire. And we acknowledge that that is not the full picture, because there are indeed other emergency food outlets. We've also heard that 978 of those who received emergency food were children, members. So we've also heard that many of those were potentially in work also. So we acknowledge that there is a growth in in-work poverty, which reflects, I think, the wider figures. 9% of those accessing food banks were homeless. And we've heard that one of the most important aspects is not just the food, but the support, advice and signposting that happens. I have to say, members, I do think that this is a concerning picture, because we're looking at an increasing trend. I don't know if members would agree that on balance, that we may want to ask that some additional consideration is given to see what additional measures can be put in place by council to mitigate the worst impacts of the universal credit rollout. I also, just as an additional piece of information for members, heard from I suppose people directly engaged in delivering service, that one of the key issues facing in particular some of our some people who are older, this is based on evidence, not on my view, accessing universal credit because of the digital requirements to doing that was proving a real barrier and concern for some people. I don't know if that bears out with what you're seeing. And additionally, I wonder whether that is something that we could give some consideration to, the whole issue of digital support, and additionally whether any additional resources in terms of advice are to be considered, members. Is that a fair summary? Do you want to?
I was just thinking, I mean, obviously this is a central government issue, but it would seem logical to me that why if it takes 5 or 6 weeks for the DWP to process universal credit claims, then why not keep them on the same benefit until so that they start on day one on universal credit, and then basically if they get paid on a weekly basis, then they won't be getting these payments in advance because of the fact that the concern is on arrears. So I would have thought that was a very simple solution to solving the 5-week wait without loans and whatever. But I mean that's just a thought, and I don't know how the experts who are dealing with this think about that.
I think, Councillor Brown, I think we can't actually do anything about what central government can do. What we can do, if we choose to as a council, is look at mitigation. So are members content that we consider, that we request that there's some further look into that? And did you want to say something, Ian?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring you up to speed with there's regular discussions on a partnership basis on the back of universal credit, which certainly one of the food banks is involved. Claire inputs regularly, and the housing associations are very involved. I mean, the housing associations massively value the role of the food banks, but in terms of that ongoing mitigation, there's regular discussions taking place with regards to that. I've got a meeting this afternoon. I suspect we'll touch on that again. There was a bit of a contingency plan put in place around the digital support to tie in with full service. That we didn't have to implement, so we had a bit of a plan around going out to rural areas, possibly laying on transport to enable people to assist, and we appointed a dedicated universal credit support officer. So there's plenty of demand for the support officer, but I say we didn't have to use the contingency. But the message that we're getting from certainly housing association partners is they're coping at the moment, but the situation is very, very fragile. So I think it's that just continue regular and monitoring really.
Just one question then. If we put more money in, will we be able to support more people and mitigate these circumstances?
Yeah, if you decide to increase, I mean, part of me did want to come to you today and suggest that we had an increase. I thought it was inappropriate in the current economic circumstances to look to do that, but to seek to sustain the current level of support. But if you did decide to increase the level of support, as you can see from the case studies that we've given you, it would have a massive impact.
Councillor Grocott.
Really pleased to hear Richard say that, and I think we should perhaps amend the recommendation to not only supporting maintaining the grant, but also to ask if that grant could be increased.
I was going to say. Thank you, members. I think upon hearing the figures, are you content that we recommend, upon the evidence that we've heard, that consideration ought to be given to increasing the sum that we top up the discretionary fund with? Thank you. Yeah. Okay, that's a very clear recommendation from Adult Select to be taken forward then. Thank you very much, members. Thank you very much for your contribution. I think it's been enormously helpful. And obviously you are welcome to stay, but you are very, very welcome to leave too, because I'm sure you're very busy. Thank you. Let them go. Okay, members, thank you. I think that was a really important topic. Can we move to the annual housing performance report and to review the performance, including homelessness, bed and breakfast use, disabled facilities grants and affordable housing delivery? Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't sure really how best to introduce this, so I'm not going to say a great deal. What we've done with this report, we've never provided a report like this in the past. I suppose we've been focused on particular themes. So this is very much headline information and doesn't go into any massive detail. In broad terms, I'm very pleased with this as an outcome for our performance for last year. I think it tells a generally positive story. The one area of frustration continues to be the need to continue to use bed and breakfast for homeless purposes. And you know, there's one or two areas in there that again where we continually to find a few challenges, but in the broad scheme of things, it was a positive year, and I say we can obviously demonstrate improvements. And I was just going to really hand it over to you if you've got any particular questions. Obviously, we've got Sarah here who could pick up on a few. Steve will be back in a minute as well. So between the three of us, should be able to pick up most queries that you may have.
Okay, thank you, members. Can I open it up for your questions? I think it's a really useful report to look at our performance across a number of measures, but of course it's not the whole picture, is it? So any questions from you then, members? Councillor Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, an interesting report, and thanks for bringing it. I noted in tables included in it the homeless-related contacts were up last year. Households threatened with homelessness also up last year. And a reference to affordable housing being provided under Section 106 funding. I think this could be an area where we've got some common concerns with other select committees, but it seems to me that one way around this might be if Monmouthshire were in a position to build its own affordable housing, and I know that at full council that has been discussed. Could you bring us up to date on where any such ideas are at the moment?
To my knowledge, the conversations about the council starting to build are very much in the preliminary preliminary stages and developing the business case, unless Mark knows any more. But I think it's very early days.
Chair, my understanding is there's a report coming to council in September for the next stage of approval to proceed with this commercial development arm, which would be more than just housing, but housing would be part of it. My colleague Debbie Howes is leading on that, so I can't provide much more detail, I'm afraid. But that's my understanding of the next sequence of events and timescales.
Other members' questions? Councillor Brown?
Yeah, thank you. I noticed that there was an underspend of about just under 2,000 for this social grant and housing finance grant at 3.15, and obviously that's due to various issues. And just wondered, there has been the purchase of extra ex-council properties in line with the housing associations, and I wondered how that was going. But 8.1, it looks like there's some sort of explanation for this, as there is some underspend was due to a one-off Welsh payment of 228,000 to mitigate against the loss of temporary accommodation management fee. And I was just wondering if something like that funding, I did watch a programme where they had a luxury bus that was parked outside a homeless shelter that was run, and it provided 50 extra bed spaces. Because it was a well-equipped bus. And, I was just wondering about that in relation to underspend and how you can use the money. And, that might help with temporary accommodation that we're paying for bed and breakfast. And I just wondered if those sort of ideas had been considered at all.
We're being encouraged by Welsh Government to look at any alternatives that will support temporary accommodation, and there is a pot of money available, the Innovative Housing Fund, and that is something Welsh Government are promoting, because they've got this target of 20,000 additional properties, and trying to encourage local authorities and housing associations to use that. So there is a bit of an opportunity for us in that context. I've got to say, obviously we don't want to. We're not dismissing it lightly, but it's something that we are. I won't say struggling, but I think the opportunities for Monmouthshire are more difficult. I mean, the common opportunity that seems to be, that's got a bit of publicity over recent years, has been the use of containers for homeless accommodation, and indeed Mark and I have had that conversation. Personally, I think the opportunities are more difficult for Monmouthshire. I know in Cardiff they've been using brownfield sites pre-development, so very much a temporary situation, and I'm unsure as to where we could potentially do that in Monmouthshire. We've also had conversations about pods, homeless pods, and indeed there's actually a conversation going on at the moment with Solace in that regard, and we've also there's interest from a local church about the pods. and that's probably all I can really say is, but we're certainly not dismissing it. But as I say, I don't think it's not as easy as it perhaps sounds on the at face value. But running alongside that, we've done a lot of work with to expand our temporary accommodation portfolio, and Monmouthshire Housing have been particularly supportive of the council in that regard. And I think it's 13 units coming online, more or less as we speak, and we'll continue to focus in that regard as well.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mark wants to just. Can I just allow Mark?
Thanks, Chair. Just very briefly, I suppose I might not be popular for saying this, and hopefully I won't come to regret it, but I suppose I just want to exercise caution about maybe some quite short-term, shiny-looking solutions to homelessness. There was a very quick and easy solution rolled out by some organisations over the winter in terms of giving homeless people tents, which hasn't so much. I mean, it's made things better for the homeless people, but it hasn't solved the problem. I mean, now we've got tent cities. These pods, steel containers, are being much heralded as solutions. But ultimately, what we need is proper accommodation for people, not living in some kind of glorified sardine can. So I would try and urge us to keep sight on the long-term objective. The other types of accommodation we're trying to provide through MLS or other initiatives. And there's an interesting programme on, I forget whether it was Manchester or Leeds, on the TV recently, and they were very much just trying to get straight to the end result of a homeless person needs a home, give them a house. And it was that simple in concept, not that simple in delivery. But I would advocate more of that approach than just some short-term shiny things.
Councillor Pavia and Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Ian, for the report. There's probably not a verge or a roundabout in the south of the county that I haven't seen Mont-CC advertising, looking for further private landlords to come forward and work with the authority. How has that transpired? But has there been a significant uptake there on that piece? And my other question is, in terms of the empty homes, obviously we've seen a declining figure over the last few years. There's no figure set for last year. You've obviously got a 4% figure for this financial year. What are the barriers there? What are the challenges in that sort of piece? I'd be interested to know. Thanks.
Well, with regards to Monmouthshire lettings, we're really, really pleased with the progress that we're making. We're up to 26 units that we are managing on behalf of private landlords, and as we speak, we've got 3 or 4 expressions of interest waiting in the wings that we're dealing with at the moment. So. And as I say, we've expanded our shared accommodation on the back of that as well. So we are growing steadily. And to be honest, if it was any quicker, we'd probably have difficulty in managing that growth. But touch wood, so far so good. And I think the short-term emphasis needs to be on continuing to develop it as a product, as a brand. To get the message out there and hopefully make it more attractive, really. With regards to empty homes, this is an area that we've been reviewing recently, particularly through Steve, sitting with him as his responsibility. You may recall a couple of years ago we brought a report to the committee just really to give an indication of the approach that we were taking and the findings that we were coming across. I'll be perfectly honest with you, the level of resource that we've been putting in is restricted because obviously there's not many There's not many of us, and the approach has been broadly based on a biannual contact. Steve does a mail out to empty homes that we identify centrally, and the general feedback that we get, well, it's probably one of mixed, isn't it? We got hostility. You know, how dare you contact us to inquire about our empty property? There's properties that are waiting to be sold. Some are having work done on them. Some are in part of estates after somebody's died. So it is quite a mixed bag. But what we have done over the last few months, we are reviewing that at the moment with a view to putting a little bit more time and more regularly. So I'm keen that it becomes a bit of a monthly activity. Something that we've done recently, and Steve can update you on this. We've done a survey of Abergavenny High Street and the flats above shops, and again, it's quite interesting. It's it's probably as you drive down, you think, oh, there'll be all there's probably lots of opportunities there, and it's surprising the challenges that appears to be throwing out. Having said that, there may be some opportunities that we will explore. But do you want to say a little bit more about that?
I conducted a survey of shops or spaces above shops in Abergavenny during February this year and during June, May and June. What came out of that as a result was that at least, bear with me, I surveyed 76 shops in total, or spaces above shops. 66% of those spaces appeared to be used, and I say appear because I went in and asked them, or if they weren't open, I looked at the tops. What became clear though is that the people I was talking to were just tenants of the shop and really didn't know what was happening above. Some of them did, but not all of them. So it's about 60% or 66% appeared to be used, and obviously the rest, 34%, did look empty. So obviously, right, there's going to be some extended work around that 34%.
Sorry, Steve.
Sorry.
I thought you just on that
Sorry,
one.
Councillor Powell was just next. Sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. Going by what you're saying now about the spaces above the houses, I got another question, but I think in these shops, it is difficult. I know of one where I spoke to the people who had the shop at the time, and they said that it would need so much work done to it that they couldn't even store things up there because the floor wasn't in good condition, so you've got that problem. But what my question is, how many of the people that are coming into Monmouthshire appearing as homeless, how many of them are actually Monmouthshire people, and how many are coming from the bigger towns like Newport and Cardiff? Back here, I can't remember how many years ago now, I had an incident in my ward where there was 2 or 3 camping there, and it turned out that they'd been down in I think it was the edge of Newport, I think, and they'd been bullied by people around them, and they come up to Monmouth to camp under the hedge because they thought they would feel safer and it was a nicer place to be. And I wonder how many of the ones that we have found camping in the shop doorways back here a few months ago in Abergavenny, how many of those were local people from Monmouthshire, or are they coming from the bigger cities to the smaller areas, and we sort of inheriting their overflow as well as our own?
I'm unable to answer.
You wouldn't know.
The general picture is that, and I don't know the figure off the top of my head, but the vast majority of homeless people that we deal with have got a local connection to Monmouthshire. Under the law, people that are fleeing violence or threats of violence, they've got the right to present themselves as homeless to the council, and we may well have a legal duty in that regard. Obviously Monmouthshire residents go the other way, and to be perfectly honest with you, there's probably more Monmouthshire residents go to the bigger authorities than come to here. Your point about rough sleeping, yes, we did have a situation over in Abergavenny for a particular reason. We didn't massively get involved with all of the individuals. The feedback I had was that indeed that not all of them were Monmouthshire residents. And I think you're correct on that. And I think that's prompted a conversation for probably for next winter. Because I think there'll be an increase in expectation from Welsh Government that we are supporting rough sleepers more and more. But in doing that, how do we do that doesn't create or stimulate new demand for Monmouthshire? And I'm not sure whether I have the answer to that, but yeah. So there's clearly a need in Monmouthshire, albeit a relatively small need, but there is a need. We do help people, and our shared housing has particularly contributed positively to that. But it's it's how we go, I suppose, that provides that support without, inflating demand.
That's one more thing. We're told that a lot of these people are single young men. Is there anything done about counselling them? Many of them, I expect, perhaps have left home, had a row or something or other. Is there anything done to help them to think about going back to their families and finding out why they, very often they've left in a bit of a row or something, and then they don't like to go back. Is there anybody that counsels them to help them perhaps return to their families?
Yeah, you're right. There are a lot of single males, and there's a whole variety of circumstances behind those situations. We do everyone that we engage with. We do go through the circumstances of why they're homeless, and that may lead to us having a duty under the homeless legislation. But as part of our Monmouthshire package, anyone that comes through as homeless or is also referred into housing support. So there's always an opportunity to speak to a housing support officer. Now that's not counselling per se, but there is a thorough assessment which may pick up on substance misuse needs, domestic abuse, alcohol, etc. And then there's further support that will be potentially arranged for those individuals if that's the case. And we're always open to assisting people to return to previous accommodation if that's an option. And to be perfectly honest, that would always be the starting point, particularly for young people. The reality is, though, that probably 9 times out of 10, that's not normally an opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the question I got is, obviously you were talking about pods and things like that. I mean, I think the sort of bus idea was really more to do with the sort of rough sleepers on temporary accommodation, when the weather gets freezing and that sort of thing, to provide something that could possibly be used in that circumstance rather than temporary bed and breakfast accommodation. I certainly wasn't advocating, obviously, the better long-term solution is basically to have good permanent accommodation for people. But I'm just talking about, you know, the demand we've got for bed and breakfast, and the fact that it's not necessarily that easy to find hotels or whatever that want to, or pubs that want to do this sort of work. And I just thought that, you know, we've got sites, you know, council-owned sites that are being up for sale at the moment, you know, that where this could be used, or parked near a church or something. That's all I was suggesting. Okay, thank you.
I'll come back to you in a minute if that's okay. Are there any more points or questions? Councillor Woodhouse.
Just one quick point about the empty flats above the shops, the survey you've carried out in Abergavenny. I'm really pleased to see that, because we've discussed that several times, and I'm sure that, you know, there are opportunities there. So thank you for starting that, and I look forward to hopefully getting some progress on that, because, as you say, I walk down the main street and I can see empty properties. Appearances can be deceptive. I appreciate that, and getting to find who the owners are. So it's going to be quite a job, but I think there is an opening there to bring people to live in the towns, which is going to be a good move.
Just to add to that, there's 3, I'll call them big landlords in Monmouthshire that we know locally, and we're going to have a conversation with those 3 as a starter for 10, and see what comes out of that.
Councillor Harris, you've got a question.
Thank you, Chair. I think the major problem with many of the flats above shops in Abergavenny is the only way you can get to them is through the shop, and that's a dead duck.
Okay, thank you. So.
Certainly, I'd like to see this idea of looking at empty properties above shops, not only for Abergavenny, but obviously there's Chepstow and Monmouth as well that you know, could benefit from that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, members, for your contributions. I note that so we've been asked to review the approach to tackling empty homes. I think Councillor Pavia's question, you know, the progress on that is actually fairly limited. And so I wonder what else we need to do in those terms. As you say, you write out, you haven't got a specifically large resource in that area. So the question I would pose back to officers is, you know, well, what is the priority on this particular item? If you're bringing it forward to us, but we don't have the resource, what else needs to happen? You're also suggesting that another priority is to apply the Council's Evolve process to Careline to increase its client base. We haven't had any particular questions around that, but I do note the very positive case studies that are in the report, and that would seem to be a very useful measure in trying to keep people independent. And I do wonder, and based on personal experience, how clear that is, that its availability and its costs to people, particularly some of the things that you have noted. I'm not familiar with the exact contraption or item that would refer to, but to what extent those are really are commonly known about, I don't know, and I just wonder if there's something further on that. I don't know if you want to come back on that.
Yeah, with regards just to finishing off the conversation about empty properties, I'm doing some work with Steve and seeing if we can put some sort of granular intelligence around it, really, identifying if there are more landlords that have more than one property, identifying if there are areas that would be susceptible to obviously looking at that perhaps housing associations can develop. So we're trying to put a bit more science behind it, really. We're sort of ahead of you in regards to the other high streets. We've started to look at Monmouth and Chepstow because I anticipated that suggestion. It's the logical next step, isn't it? If it's available in Abergavenny, is it available in the other 2 towns? So we are doing that sort of work. The difficulty we have, if we're going to be realistic, is about
Resource?
The enforcement.
Oh.
Well, we've got the issue about resource, let's be honest, we're not an over-resourced department, but about the enforcement levels, I mean, where do you go if somebody turns around and says, actually, the property's in pretty good order and I don't want to do anything with it? You know, do you go down compulsory purchase? Do you go down EDMOs? It's, you know, we do need to think about that a little bit more, don't we, about the reality of the world in which we live in. Some people sit very happily on an empty property, and if it isn't, you know, causing anybody any issue and it looks maintained, then it's a difficult political.
Just to come back on the empty property item, is that some way in which we talked about innovative approaches? I've written down the Innovative Housing Fund, for example. So we're not particularly keen on Mark's comment around temporary shiny, but for example, bringing properties back into use that are in some disrepair. Is that something which is also covered? I just wondered with this Innovative Housing Fund, for example, because if it is, then I wonder whether that is certainly something that perhaps the committee has talked about a number of possibilities around high streets, around other properties, whether that's something we would request could be further explored.
Yeah, we've had some conversation with Monmouthshire Housing. They've just finished 2 innovative housing projects, very interesting, both of them very different. So those conversations are being had. It's just a very long journey, isn't it? You know, the realities of where we are and bringing those schemes into place are quite difficult. So, but you know, we are having those conversations, and we are looking at the information that we have regarding empty properties and what we can do with it, as opposed to just sending out a mail shot that is probably largely ignored. So we're engaging a lot more with landlords and on the back of MLS and other landlord forums, and seeing if actually we can offer them ways of bringing properties back into use, and that's probably largely going to be marketed as well on the back of home improvement loans, and targeting people and saying, you know, is it financial? Can we help you, obviously, by making a loan to bring that property back into use? So we are doing as much as we think we can on the resource that we currently have.
And so just on that point then, we have a housing crisis. We have limited resources, you've just mentioned, in your department. And so is it the case that we ought to be requesting that some further resources targeted at this? You know, you talked about the community housing company making slow progress. You talked about this, you know, business of bringing properties back into use, or empty properties into being homes for people, being slow progress. You talked about you know, other opportunities that we might have to develop other solutions, all being fairly slow progress, from getting homeless people, you know, or people who are in housing need into homes as being a priority. Is there a resourcing issue contained in that, and is it something that we should be requesting or recommending is considered?
I think in the scheme of the list that you've gone through there, I think the empty homes is the one that we've probably given less attention to, you know, because I think broadly we're of the view the opportunities, partly on the back of what Sarah said, won't be massive, but I think in the context of this conversation, the current gap is our level of intelligence, and I think the conversations that we've started, I think the best way forward is for us to better and fully understand the Monmouthshire position, and then come back to you and say, right, this is what we found. Because interestingly, I suppose there's an image of an empty property, and certainly when you go to, you know, we've been to conferences and good practice sessions with other authorities, and the Monmouthshire empty property generally doesn't fit the norm. And I think I think it's helpful to start getting into conversations about, you know, known examples. And I say, I won't name any names, but there's an empty shop in Abergavenny, which probably most people will be familiar with. We've got a contact for the owner, and I think that suddenly becomes a real example that we can all relate to, and we can all sit and work through whether there are opportunities and understand whether there are any barriers or not. So that would be my recommendation. Let's suss it out better.
So what we're saying then is that your approach to the tackling homes is reasonable, but we need to bring that back at a later date. So we're recommending that you do some further work on that and bring that back for us to look at and scrutinise a little bit further. Yes. The other one that you mentioned is around your disabled facilities grants. We haven't had a particular discussion about that today, but that, along with the care line and I suppose providing properties, does bring one in mind that housing has got a much wider role to play than the piece that we're looking at today. Members, it's got a particular role to play in supporting the whole social well-being, social care aspect of what we want to see, I suppose, for our communities here in Monmouthshire.
Yeah, just a little bit of narrative that you touched on earlier. I think it'd be helpful. The Evolve process, which is basically taking a council service through a process that involves lots of different stakeholders to see how that service is performing is fairly embryonic, if I'm honest with you. Careline has sat very successfully, from my perspective, within housing for obviously since I've been working for the council since 2007. I don't necessarily agree that it has to move over to social care. I think the service can be provided where it is. It's just a case of funding. And you sort of touched on the aspect about the costs, and do people know what it costs and what's available. We're doing some work now. A colleague of mine went to do an awareness session at a hospital last week. We're doing another one at the end of the month. I sit on the chair of the Assistive Technology Group, so I'm fully well versed with what's going on in the other 21 authorities. And let me tell you, Monmouthshire isn't that far behind, whatever the way they want to dress it. So I know what good practice looks like, and I know where we want to get to. We're also having some very early stage conversations with Newport about them relaunching their own service and where we would fit in as a neighbouring authority, and possibly even looking at a sort of health-based model, sitting on that an Iron Bevan footprint. We've had some significant funding that we've managed to get from the Intermediate Care Fund, which has partly funded a dementia study that I authored on the back of an Iron Bevan and what had been provided for people with dementia and what would be possible going forward, because the landscape has massively changed over the last 3 or 4 years and continues to evolve around artificial intelligence and machine learning. So, there's a big move. As a local authority, we'll move very much from where we are now over to a completely different landscape provision within the next 5 to 10 years, I would say, really. And we're starting to make those changes now. It's very positive, I believe, assistive technology and what it can do. We have very good relationships with our colleagues in social care. But again, we come back to we are quite a small team. We're talking a lot less than sort of 3 full-time equivalents. So we do very well at what we do. The service has grown. Ian and I had a discussion this morning. We're over the 800 mark, which we had an aspiration to achieve for a number of years, and we've consistently managed to keep that up there for nearly a year now. So we're going in the right direction. It's just small incremental steps, really, and trying to work out where we're going forward.
Thank you. So just to kind of conclude that conversation then, because I am aware people have got to go. We're content with that, but I think we want to note perhaps the wider role that housing has to play in social care, and whether that is something that we want to review further over the next, over this period, members. Is that fair to say? Yes? Okay. And we're content to support the recommendations in the report, but we note that there is a lot of further work to do, and we would welcome seeing those as they develop. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. That concludes that report. The minutes for accuracy only, please, of the special meeting of Adult Select Committee on the 29th of April. I'll find them under all my pieces of paper. So, members, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, page 9, long meeting, page 10, page 11, page 12, page 13. Accurate for those who are present. Can I have someone to propose and move those? Okay. Minutes of the meeting held on the Tuesday, the 30th of April at 2019. Again, for accuracy, please, members. Page 1.
Chair, there is nobody down there as chair or vice chair. All right. 30th of April, present.
Oh, right, yeah.
Chair, vice chair, no names.
Yeah, I chaired it.
Okay. Can we then, with that amendment, agree that? Okay. Rest of the pages.
Could I just ask a question on the page 2 of that, which is page 60?
Is it an accuracy item, Councillor Brown? Because if it's
well,
not, we'll
it's
come back to it.
matters arising, really.
Okay, well, can we just leave that for a moment then, please, and just go for accuracy? So that's page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. Okay, we'll come back to that. So when we come to the action list then, agenda item 10, and they were to receive particular items from an Iron Bevan University Health Board. So there was an update on the data sets used for the older adult mental health care pilots, an update on clinical futures, and also to receive a higher level action plan. I believe to date those haven't been received. So
yes, Chair, we've chased those, and the last that we had was that they're on the case with that, but I will chase them after this meeting. Just to note, because I think we discussed this briefly at the start of the meeting, the action list is just for that particular day, so that's why you'll see only those items on there. We produce one for each of the meetings, so at that meeting that was a special and it was just the health board, but yes, there are future actions that we need to build in today into our work programme.
Okay. And just on that point, I notice it in that in those minutes, there was an action to receive some further information on the viability of single dwelling affordable housing contributions, an action on EcoFlex monitoring, and an action on gypsy travellers. And members will know that some of us undertook a visit to some accommodation in Torvine, and we will be arranging another workshop fairly soon. Okay. And then on to our forward work programme. I'll come to your point right at the end. Yeah, please, if you wouldn't.
The next meeting we had scheduled to bring you the corporate plan and the annual report of the director. Now, those two reports tie well together. Even though they are two separate reports, a lot of the content is the same. We have a slight issue that the corporate plan is not going to be ready to be brought to you at that meeting. And also we've had a request that possibly it would make sense to scrutinise it jointly with CYP, because the content really is largely overarching in terms of the social services remit. CYP Select have had a separate report on education from the Chief Officer. So this is really the social services aspect. So my suggestion to you, given that the corporate plan is not ready, would be possibly that you have a special meeting in September and a joint meeting between both committees to scrutinise that. A one-off meeting, but it would make more sense rather than receiving reports and essentially scrutinising the same thing again and feeling some element of deja vu. But if that's the case, if you were to agree that leaves you with a shorter meeting on the 23rd of July, which is the Social Housing Grant Report and the Revenue and Capital Outturn Report. But I'm also aware that, as I mentioned in the pre-meeting, the Chair and I will be sitting down with Julie and Eve as Chief Officers, and also Councillor Penny Jones, to start to frame the forward work programme and to bring to you items for scrutiny. Chair, I do believe we have an issue with the date as well, of the 23rd of July.
So can we just come back to you, members, with an update on that and on the potential for a special meeting with Children and Young People Select? Is that okay? Okay.
Okay, thank you, Chair. In relation to the actual forward work plan, we've had quite a lot of reports to do with housing and so forth, but it's been some time since we've had. I appreciate that the annual report of the Director may cover some of this, but we did have a report some time ago about turning the world upside down and the approach to social services. And I don't believe we've had a lot of reports from adults in relation to the social services and care home and provision for the elderly at all. And that seems to be slipping from our agenda, which seems to be concentrating quite a lot on housing, which obviously is important, but we do have a role in terms of adults and social care of the elderly, which I don't think we're covering particularly well at the moment. So perhaps that could be put in for a report where we've only got 2 reports, because I'd like to see how the officers have been appointed to deal with that, and I would like to know how it's actually working out. And this comes back to the idea of having co-optees on it, because I know that Age UK are doing a bit of work about care homes and about supporting them with dementia needs, and the fact that in care homes the average length of stay is 18 months, so there is sort of like an end of life issue there. So I think we do need a bit more on that, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. I think absolutely agree. In fact, at Cabinet the other day, there was a particular item which was about the fragility in domiciliary care, and I was going to suggest that we, when we sit down with the Cabinet member and the head of adults, we discuss bringing forward information for you to look at and scrutinise with regard to how we are doing in terms of the provision of support services to, in particular, in all our support services really, and care services that we provide across the board to older people and to the wider general population. So we will certainly do that. You just mentioned, so it might be helpful to bring it up at this point, just before we conclude. I was just hoping to sound out, I was going to ask Hazel to bring something forward to the next meeting on options for appointing co-optees, if you were content with that. And the question is who. So it would be really helpful if members had a bit of a, throw in of ideas. For example, we can always invite people as and when to our meetings. But if you had a desire, members, to actually physically co-opt people to come on an ongoing basis, for example, if you think about our Access for All forum, so they have a wide range of organisations that are members of that forum, whether they would be interested in being co-opted members of this group. Because I know that they do bring forward a lot of really good quality information about the services that people are receiving So that's for consideration. Would it be worthwhile us asking Hazel to bring something forward and for you to give our suggestions? Councillor.
So I shouldn't really be saying anything, but I think it would be better to have people when we need them, because it depends what the agenda is and what the subjects are we're discussing, and we have a lot of people who are very good to come along, as we did today, when there is an issue, rather than having co-opted members coming, even if it's not in their sphere, if you know what I mean. They might feel they have to come even if it's not something that they're particularly in their domain. I don't know, that's just my...
Okay, should we just, perhaps we could ask Hazel to bring something forward, and we can have a proper discussion about the pros and cons and some potential options if we do want to pursue that, members. Is that worthwhile? Yes, okay, so we recommend that Hazel do that. And
could we, if we can think of an organisation that's relevant, could we actually suggest them or not?
if you have any suggestions of organisations that may be relevant, forward them to Hazel and she can include that in the options. And then finally, members, I can't be here, sorry, the dates were set before, weren't they, on the 23rd of July. So personally, I'd prefer to try and move it, but if that proves difficult, then is it more difficult to move it? That's what I'm asking members, really. Otherwise, I can ask Councillor Brown if she's available to chair it. I don't know whether we'll be successful at getting these other reports to July, because as we know with council, we've had some difficulty in getting reports forward to the June council, and they're coming forward to the July meeting now. If we were to move it, it would be to the first week in July. But if it's easier for you to retain that 23rd of July date.
I can't make the 23rd.
Oh, right, good. No, just kidding. No, I mean good, because I can't either. That's what I meant. Sorry, I didn't mean it like that, Councillor Grocott. Yes. That's exactly what I meant, Councillor Powell. I'm glad you... would it be okay to potentially move it, or does that cause issues?
I think we just have to agree a date now if we're going to move it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so we know where we're going.
Get one's diary. Yeah. Oh, my internet's not working. So you're trying to look at your calendar? Okay.
I think we've got to bear in mind whether there's rooms.
Yeah, we can always move. We can do something. Apparently the internet's not working very well, members. So we were looking towards the first week of July. I was going to say, I'm trying to get my diary up. I just wonder.
It is
quite early, yeah.
Would the 4th of July be any good? Because there's already a meeting at 3:00 here anyway.
Hazel's just checking the diary.
Just say that I did have some ideas about running some training for you on future generations, but it seems to be a problem because some members are on Lower Wye Area Committee, and that's posing an issue. So is everybody free on the 4th of July? Have you got any other meetings, commitments diaried? Okay, well, that looks like a contender. Do you want to agree that now? That might be easier. It would be in the morning, but for you to be aware, in the afternoon at 3:00 is a workshop on economic growth ambition, which is for all members.
Can I just say I am not available for that one?
That's okay. But just for everybody to know, it is for all members, because the economic growth ambition is really, really important, because it will shape some of the direction of the LDP.
You can come to the one in the morning, though, can't you? No.
You can't make the select if it was that morning.
What about the second?
There's something in the chamber in the morning.
What's in the chamber?
It's a external thing. I'm also not available. Let's have a look. The conference room. Yeah, the conference room is also booked. We've looked at some of this because I was trying to set up some training for you, and there's just nothing free at all. So the second is not going to work. The third is booked out as well. The first is totally booked out as well. This has been the problem with trying to get some of these workshops that I've been setting up for you. Everything's just completely booked out. The following week, the chair won't be here. Well, they're definitely not going to, the corporate plan is definitely not going to be ready for either. The report that you mentioned on domiciliary care, that won't be ready for that. But I can do a report for you on co-option, and you can at least have a good discussion on that, and we can, because we've been around the houses on that. If some of you remember before, we've discussed, and we've stuck with the status quo. You might want to change that, but we've got 2 other reports, so it would deal with this business. I mean, the Friday's busy as well, to be honest, and the chair, you go away on the 8th, don't you?
Yeah.
So really, the only time we can do it. Are you free at all on the 4th, Sheila? No. No. No.
I can certainly make the 29th. Oh, no, the 29th, the 30th.
Of July?
Yeah.
The 30th of July is free.
Yeah, that's fine with me, members.
Yeah? Yeah? Usually people are often, I know Councillor Pavia won't be here because he's told me he's going on leave. But I mean, if that's what you'd like to do, that's
we may
fine.
be able to get a domiciliary care report or something around
Yeah.
care by then, which
Okay.
would be really helpful, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we go for the 30th, Tuesday the 30th, in the morning.
Yeah, 9:30 pre-meet.
Thank you, members. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you.